Welcome, everyone. So we're going to get started now. My name is Colin Bader, and I will be your host for today's event, Solve Climate by 2030, Climate Change in the Classroom and Beyond, in which 4 UNE experts will explain why it's so important for all students, from the humanities to the health professions, to learn about climate change and climate justice. My role at UNE is as an associate clinical professor for health, wellness, and occupational studies. And I'm also a member of the UNE Planetary Health Council, the group bringing you today's event. Today's event is brought to you through a partnership between the Planetary Health Council, the Center for Excellence in Collaborative Education, the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, along with help from UNE Communications. Since 2017, UNE has been an institutional member of the International Planetary Health Alliance, a Harvard-led consortium of more than 340 universities, organizations, and other institutions spanning more than 64 countries. At UNE, the Planetary Health Council is working to strengthen connections between our robust environmental sciences and our health professions programs, and to provide planetary health content through academics, research, and events like this one. This event is part of a global effort to solve climate by 2030, which is organized annually through Bard College. Over 1,000 other universities, colleges, and schools around the world are conducting similar events right now on their campuses, and this is UNE's 3rd year taking part. This event today will address interprofessional competencies of communication and roles and responsibilities, and can be applied toward UNE students' interprofessional honors distinction. So to start today's program, I will first briefly introduce our speakers. I will then turn it over to the panelists themselves, who will give their presentations. And lastly, we are saving time at the end for audience participation and discussion with all of you. We're going to want to hear your thoughts. So our first panelist today is Professor Greg Labonte from the UNE School of Biological Sciences. Our second panelist is Professor Ben England from the UNE School of Mathematical and Physical Sciences. Our third panelist is Professor Jan Froelich from the UNE Occupational Therapy Program. And our fourth and final panelist is Professor Stephen Burt from the School of Arts and Humanities. For our closing discussion with all of you in the audience, a senior student in the UNE Marine Affairs program, Jillian Ferguson, will serve as our discussion moderator. So many thanks to our panelists, many thanks to our student discussion moderator. We're really grateful to have you here with us today. I will now turn it over to our first panelist, Professor Greg Labonte.
Thank you, Colin. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. Nice turnout and lots of different professional groups I'm seeing in the chat, so that's really great. So I'm going to talk about how to actually get climate change or climate justice into your classrooms, specifically from sort of a teaching perspective. So you can go to the next slide. So what I want everyone to do right now, whether you teach or not, I see some people who teach and some people who are students, but whether or not, what do you think are barriers to getting climate justice or climate change into your classroom? So I know a lot of classes don't talk about it, but why is that? So what I want you to do not send it, but I just want you to write, take like 5-10 seconds and write in the chat just something that is a barrier to why you cannot talk about it in your class. So take 10 seconds here and just write it down in the chat. Don't send it, just write it down. Okay, if everyone wants to send what they have written, go ahead. Look at all these answers. This is so great. You can hit the next slide, Colin, as well. So I see all these answers that everyone is putting in. Can you go back real quick, Colin? Thank you. I see everyone, all these answers can be controversial, limited time, lack of time, political, controversial time, lots of time, not enough misinformation, not enough expertise on the topic. These are all, I pre-made these because these are typically the common ones. Not relevant, I see in there as well. Not enough time being, I would say, the overwhelming favorite here in the chat. And I agree that all these reasons seem valid, but what I'm here to do today is to show some ways that, teachers can get climate change and climate justice into the classroom, even though they have not enough time, or it might be controversial, or right there might not be enough relevant knowledge. So, okay, you can go to the next slide. So there's three real ways that I'm going to touch on, and one involves a level of creativity that I was very uncomfortable with when I first started. I teach biology and ecology, so it's pretty easy for me to get climate change in there. Climate justice is a little more touchy-feely, and I have to get a little creative. So one thing that I did to sort of get students engaged was to come up with assignments that were done outside of the classroom that were different. That would really capture their attention. So what I ended up doing was I made a podcast assignment where students have to discuss, through a 5 to 10 minute conversation with themselves or interviewing someone, discuss the utility value of things like climate change and climate justice, why it's important to learn, how it's going to help them moving forward. Okay. Go ahead and hit next. So all these things, you start to connect and you realize that learning about climate change and climate justice, it's not just important because you think it's important, but it connects a lot of different vital sort of systems in your life, your career path, your social life, personal life, emotional comfort, how you feel about the world, how you look at other people. And so it's this exploration of thought that really inspires a lot of understanding of climate change, climate justice, and how it is impacting you as an individual here at the University of New England. So this is one way. This is the most complex, convoluted way for sure. I am not creative at all. I can't paint. I'm not artistic. I don't have this creative thought process. I'm a biologist. So it's, what is this? Here are the numbers. What is that telling us, right? And so this took me a long time to really come together. Go to the next slide if you could. So you can play the movie on. Luckily, what if I teach calculus? What if it's not a relevant topic, right? Well, there is this new technology that I'm sure all of you are aware of, and it's called ChatGPT. And what ChatGPT is so great at doing is being creative for you. So I typed in here, what activities can I include in my collegiate level calculus class involving climate change or justice? Off the top of my head, I can't really give you any, right? It's very difficult for me to be creative and get it into the classroom. Here, ChatGPT can give me almost an infinite amount of different ways to get it into the classroom. And I know there's a lot of teachers that are sort of like, they don't want students to use ChatGPT, or they don't want others to use ChatGPT. I think it's an incredible resource if used correctly. And one of the ways to use it correctly is to sort of spawn ideas that you yourself might not be able to come up with. So now it gives me all these different ways that I can get in it. And what it does is it sort of spurs ideas for myself as the teacher or as the student. And it's like, oh, social justice and environmental calculus. Students can explore the relationship between calculus and social justice by examining the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized communities. That I understand. And now I can create an assignment, or I can create a homework assignment or a discussion topic surrounding one of these points, right? So this is a great way, if you're not creative, you can minus out of this, Colin, you can use ChatGPT to bring climate justice or climate change topics into your classroom, especially if you do not have the expertise. That is another really, really great way to bring it into your classroom. You can go to the last slide. And so the last thing is, when you bring this topic up for people, a lot of people feel that it needs to be the center of attention. It needs to be the entire class, or it needs to be an entire lesson plan. It does not need to be that. For teachers who are struggling to get into this class, or if you, a student, want to recommend to a teacher, if asked upon, like, how can we get this into our curriculum? It can be something very small, right? It can be just a 5-minute discussion after you've done a very deep lecture, or you have 10 minutes at the end of class. Instead of sending everyone home early, maybe you split them off into small groups. You can hit next real quick, Colin. One last thing there, right? You can do small groups, break up into small groups, and then have a larger group discussion in those 5 minutes. And I know I teach, there's always one class, at least one throughout the semester, that I have 5 minutes at the end, right? And I think that everyone has experienced something similar. And so it can just be a discussion, right? Again, that exploration of thought on the matter of climate justice and climate change, and that's important. Exploration of thought for students in the classroom is very, very important, I think, about these topics, because they're going to go on, students are going to go on to vote on these topics. And if they haven't thought about it at all, that's probably an issue. So it could be something very, very small, but it could have a very, very large impact. So those are 3 very quick ways that teachers can get climate change, climate justice into the classroom, even if you don't have a lot of time, even if you don't think you have the expertise, right? Or if it's a touchy subject. Those are 3 ways that you can really get it into the classroom. So that is it for me. Thank you for listening to me babble there for a little bit. And now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Ben England.
Thank you, Greg. So I'm going to try to talk about some areas of climate change data that I think are underreported in the media, and that the media tends to be a little bit doom and gloom and tends to polarize people. And I think that there's some information out there that is just not getting a lot of attention about progress in this area. And next slide. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm also going to talk about the topic of climate justice. And specifically, I wanted to try to quantify it because, hey, I'm a math guy. So we're going to look at some data around that that I think gives you some interesting and surprising results about it. So we'll do that in the second half. All right, next slide. So this slide is talking about the progress that's been made in dropping the cost of producing renewable energy. And it goes in the lower x-axis there, you can see it's going from 1983 up to 2021 roughly. And the curves I'd like to draw your attention to are the blue dotted line that's sort of over on the left there, which is wind power. And also there's a purple line, solar photovoltaic, that starts around 2010, and the very high on the upper side of the graph, it comes down. And there's the other thing to pay attention to is there's sort of an orange oval, and it says fossil fuels high end of the price range, which is around 17 cents per kilowatt hour, kind of in the middle. And there's also another orange oval around 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the low end of the fossil fuel price range. So what's remarkable is that in 2021, we've reached the point where both solar and wind have reached a cost level that is on the low end of the fossil fuel cost level. And that is a huge, huge milestone, because that's the point at which it pays the utility companies to switch. And so that's, and in fact, they are switching, because I just read in Slashdot yesterday that for the first time, renewable energy, including solar, wind, and hydro, outproduced coal coal is dropping like a stone right now for energy production. And so there is something happening that, and it's important to realize that, because a lot of times people feel like nothing's going to be done about this. And in fact, there is something being done about it. It's just the cost structure wasn't there to make it happen before. So next slide. This slide is talking about the area of the cost of energy storage. And one of the flies in the ointment for renewable energy was that if the sun wasn't shining and the wind wasn't blowing, you couldn't get any energy out of it. And the thing that was missing was cheap, low cost, scalable energy storage technologies. And the good news is, this is data from Pacific Northwest National Labs. In 2021, which is 2 years ago, we are now starting to see these technologies in available. And I'm just going to highlight a couple. The blue circle is compressed air. So basically what they're doing is they're pumping air into a giant cavern underground, and then using renewable energy. And then when there is no renewable energy available, they release that air to drive a turbine and generate energy from that. Another example of that is PSH, which is basically using renewable energy to drive water uphill. And then when there's no renewable energy available, you let the water come downhill and drive a turbine. So the point is, these are both methods you could have probably built 100 years ago. So these are not like requiring futuristic new science to produce. These are things we can do right now. And there's other examples, thermal energy, where you heat something up and then you use the heat later. So I think that's a very hopeful picture economically. So next slide, please. All right, so the next topic I want to get into is the climate justice one. And what I've heard on some of the conservative channels is, well, even if you believe that global warming exists, China is producing way more than we are, so why don't you talk to them about it? Okay, so what I decided to do was to look at greenhouse gases from the point of view of who produced them and which countries, and also look at it from a point of view of per capita, in other words, per person production. And then put those two together to get kind of a picture of sort of who made the mess. And so in this picture, we're seeing for the last 20 years, China's production has been going up, and now it's like double the United States. So it's true that they are producing more right now. Next slide. However, if you look at a much longer time frame, which is going back to 1785, and look at CO2 emissions in this case, which is, I believe, somewhat similar to greenhouse gas emissions, then what you can see is on the very right side, you can start to see China coming up, but the United States has been at this for a long time, as has Germany and other countries. So the greenhouse gas that's in the atmosphere is the result of the entire production over all of this time. It's not just what's happening right now that matters. So to get an accurate picture, you have to look at the cumulative production. Next slide, please. And here we see that while China is catching up, the United States is still way ahead in terms of CO2 production. There's a few other countries that are in the running, but they're much lower. And in particular, India's far lower. And so basically, from a cumulative point of view, we see that the US is in the lead. Next slide, please. And we also see that from a per capita point of view, it is as well. So this is looking at per person production over time. And basically, if you add up the area under this curve, which is sort of a mathematical concept from calculus, you get the total CO2 production, right? And next slide. So in this graph, I'm trying to put those two concepts, per capita and cumulative production, together. And you look at this graph from the bottom up. So the most populous country in the world is China, followed by India, followed by the US. So if we're going upwards in the graph. And what you see here is that for these 15 most populated countries, the US is by far the leader in per capita greenhouse gas production over history, right? The last 2 centuries. So what that means is, in terms of climate justice, we have, a sort of bigger debt to pay off there in terms of cleaning up the mess. And it's not going to play well in places like China or India if we go fly over there in our Learjets and tell them that they have to cut their production when we haven't, cleaned up our mess yet. So that's kind of my quantitative take on climate justice. Next slide. So to conclude, we shouldn't be lecturing everybody about it, but we should lead by example. And we are doing that to a certain extent. And an example of that would be Tesla. That was done in the United States. There was no electric car industry till they came along. And there's lots of battery innovation and other things that we're contributing, along with a lot of other countries. So we can profit by helping others to adopt these technologies, and we can solve this problem. And so there's no need to sort of give up on it. So that's basically all I had to say about it. I'm going to pass the torch to Jen Froelich, and take it away, Jen.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Greg, as well. I'm going to talk about fostering connections to reduce discouragement and support climate action as teachers. Next slide. It turns out that isolation is the enemy. Is that my first slide? Isolation is the enemy of building a satisfying life, and it's also the enemy of climate action. Next slide. Oh, now I'm in my group. So I've had the privilege for many years of teaching occupational therapy courses with a focus on using listening partnerships to refine the art of listening and build connections within and across racial and cultural lines. Those courses have been: one, communication, culture, and group process, and the other class, therapeutic use of self and group interventions. Next slide. So in using listening partnerships, we've been able to support development and achievement of goals related to personal health and wellness as future health practitioners, because if you don't take good care of yourself, you're of no use to your clients. Number two, racially and culturally effective communication. We have such diverse communities that we work with as healthcare practitioners. Group leadership skills. And then about 10 years ago, both students and faculty and I began to think it was important to also address some goals in listening partnerships related to care of the environment, because it became an increasingly pressing issue. Next slide. We all benefit from having a listening partner or a listening buddy to achieve all of our desired goals. And because of the complexity of climate change, this is especially true of goals related to the climate crisis. So students in my class actually would form buddies, form listening partners, and check in with one another about all their goals related to personal health and wellness, related to effective communication, group leadership, and also care of the environment. Next slide. I would invite students to participate in listening exchanges and to think about climate and how it is affecting them. They did listening exchanges on many topics, but here's some of the questions that we addressed related to climate. A place that you love and cherish. What do you love too much to lose? Where do you get discouraged? What action have you already taken? What brings you hope about the climate? What are your climate goals for the next week, month, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, or forever? And who can you take action with? So this is what they talked about in listening exchanges, and then they'd often report back within the whole class about some of those topics. Next slide. Here are some of the key points about making listening partnerships go well. The first thing is take turns for an agreed upon time. So a lot of times it was 5 minutes each, sometimes 2 minutes each. Sometimes my students had homework 10 minutes each in a listening partnership. You don't interrupt your listening partner. You allow feelings to be expressed for the clearing of minds. When we vent, we can think better. You don't give advice. You try to remember that most discouragement is old and has to do with early discouragement in our lives. For example, every child is born thinking they're going to have about 5 full-time parents and a whole community raising them, and that doesn't happen anywhere in the world. So some early discouragement can get in the way of us being hopeful in the present. Remember that humans are designed to work together and take on very, very big challenges. This is what we're up for as humans. Next slide. Another thing I've emphasized a lot is racially and culturally effective communication in listening partnerships, because again, in the US, one of the most diverse nations in the world, we have to be real smart about relating to people from all different backgrounds. And the way to move in that direction towards being effective is to first really increase awareness of your own racial and cultural background and that of others. So in listening partnerships, students would have a chance to do this. Think about their own racial and cultural background and listen to that of others. They would also be encouraged to look at the historical context of diverse groups of people. That's something we all have to get smarter about. To look at the strengths and challenges of different racial and cultural groups. And in the class on communication, culture, and group process, students would often do presentations on what they learned about different cultural groups. And I'd encourage practicing listening exchanges with people from a variety of racial and cultural groups to get really smart about relating to diverse groups of people. Next slide. So one thing that's become really clear about climate is that you have to be smart about the impact of climate on different racial and cultural groups. And I've been listening a lot to Indigenous people and many people of color, students of color, faculty. And some really key things to think about are, number one, that Indigenous, Native, and global majority is a phrase used to describe people of color because they are the majority of people on the planet, are most affected by climate change, really important. And they all have a deep understanding of effective climate solutions. So we have to really listen to them a lot. 80% of Earth's biodiversity is on land where Indigenous and Native people reside and provide their loving stewardship. It's important to learn about Native and Indigenous people whose land you reside on and back their sovereignty and leadership if we're going to have a chance related to the climate, because they're so smart and connected often to the lands upon which they live. And the other thing that seems very, very key is learning about and supporting proposals for climate reparations to Caribbean, Latin American, African, and Asian people. The global South, as Ben pointed out just how much the US contributed to climate change, and we're not as affected by it as people in the global South. People in the global South have contributed the least, and they're the most affected by climate change. So if you're going to be smart in relating to people from different cultural and racial groups, you have to understand this really important difference between who's contributed and who's affected most by climate change. Next slide. So every effort we can make to support ourselves, our students, and those around us in uniting with people across societal divisions is important to preventing catastrophic climate change. My Native friends tell me it's all about connection. The science is important, the statistics are important. All of that is really, really important, but connecting with people across the many, many divisions that exist in society is so key. And discovering how much we all really care. Everybody cares and wants to make a difference. Slide. These are just some of my favorite climate resources I wanted you to know about. So maybe we can make these available to the participants. Climate Adam on making climate action easy. Mia Motley on climate reparations from the Barbados. Sustaining All Life about listening and reducing emotional barriers to climate change. Wabanaki Reach on native sovereignty in Maine. And Yuval Noah Harari has got this great group that's identified that it really will only cost about 2% of global GDP in addition to what we're spending now to prevent climate catastrophe. So these are all hopeful resources, and we need to remain hopeful in our connections with other around solving climate. Thank you. And now our next presenter is Steve Burt.
Hi, I teach drawing and studio classes as part of UNE's core curriculum, as well as to the art majors. And it's my experience that students on the whole are quite concerned about climate change, but they only need a gentle nudge to get that concern out in the open. I use poetry as a way to get students to think about form and feeling, as well as other essays that more directly address environmental issues, such as Ann Herbert's essay, Handy Tips on How to Behave at the End of the World. It's a great introduction to thinking about how climate change affects us personally. And another similarly, Thich Nhat Hanh's essay called Interbeing, which is a wonderful meditation on the interconnectedness of everything and everyone. And that's from the book, Seeing Systems, Peace, Justice, and Sustainability. So those are great sources. Good drawing and good art is much more than just replicating appearances. It's really about conveying feeling and what we know and how, and it does so with depth and real impact. The following images are part of my work with students in the studio concentration seminar. It's a thesis class or an advanced studies class for students. And half the students chose environmental issues with no real pressure on my part. And another half chose issues of selfhood and identity. So those are two really prominent themes that are coming up again and again in the studio art program. And here's a bit of Isabella's artist statement, in which she says, the purpose of my art is to help bring attention to this crisis by reminding people of all the smaller, beautiful things in life that the state of Maine has to offer us all. Next slide. This is Isabella with her impact. Initially, she started with these tiny little lino cuts that really didn't have an impact visually, and then she came up with these really wonderful visual statements. The top one, called Leaving Lobsters, is about lobster migration to deeper waters. There's the last oak tree and many other images. The next slide. So students in this class have to come up with a theme and an artist statement. This is Edward Upton's. The waste that we create is often identified as pollution, as it is discarded into the environment, even though it came from our environment. What makes it pollution is that we are returning it in a different form than when it was extracted. By changing the forms and chemical makeup of different items, we are changing the chemical makeup of our world. We are changing the chemical makeup faster than most biological life can adapt. Every piece I make has a different meaning, but all my work falls under the broad category of my own outrage of how we treat our world. Next slide. And this is Ed with his installation at Engine Gallery, which half of it was made from garbage and half was stenciled spray paint work. And a really passionate student about what he's trying to address his concerns with the environment. Next slide. This is Shelby Khanna's part of her artist statement. I hope that viewers can see the beauty within my work, and I hope to inspire viewers to take time each day to appreciate the beauty that we tend to take for granted. Next slide. And Shelby did these sort of wonderful little bas reliefs that she painted, and also a painting on an antique window. And even though this isn't addressing climate change per se, it's addressing her interest in the natural world, and also her desire that people really appreciate that much more. Next slide. From Morgan Holly's artist statement, I feel that if we use art to help start movements, for example, helping improve the ecosystem we live in, it will help improve our lifestyle along with our habits of consumption, to lessen the effects of global warming, pollution, homelessness, or the focus point of this project, extinction. And next slide. And this is Morgan's map of endangered animals within the New England area. And they're really, unfortunately, I don't have a close-up of them, but they're really wonderful pieces. It's really also important to realize that art can convey joy and love for the environment and things. So it's not all doom and gloom, even though the students initially thought to, their initial proposal for the title of the exhibition was Doom. I think in the end, they also feel like it is by doing something, they're taking action. Next slide. This is just a few of sources. One is the Sun magazine, which is a great humanitarian journal, has cutting edge interviews, and in addition to really great fiction writing and photo essays. The Scene Systems textbook is available from Eco Challenge, and it's basically a discussion course that could easily be integrated into many people's curriculum. And then finally, a link to from poets.org to the poem Dead Stars by Ada Limon. But it's also, you can sign up for a daily poem and get, it's a really great source for contemporary poetry. I encourage everyone to open your classes with a poem or short essay or thought experiments to set the tone of the class and get students to feel grounded. And, maybe you could do a little drawing exercise, but curiosity is key. Engaging our students' curiosity, and art is a great way to do it. But I think we all, after hearing these presentations, we all have an art to what we do, specifically in the classroom, and it's wonderful to be part of this. So I will pass it back to Colleen, and we'll go from here.
So many thanks to you, Stephen, and to all our panelists today for sharing your expertise, your experiences, your creativity. We really appreciate it. So now I'm going to transition our event today and encourage questions, comments from you all in our audience. So please use the Zoom chat function and go ahead and just type in your questions, stories, reactions, ideas, comments, anything like that, right into the chat. We definitely want to hear all of your perspectives on these critical issues as current and future leaders in the health professions and the environmental sciences, and as engaged citizens of our community and world. Our student discussion moderator, Jillian Ferguson, will facilitate the conversation.
Just to start us off before all the questions come flooding in. So hearing from you guys have been talking about advocating as teachers. Do you guys feel that students should advocate for these conversations, or do you feel that it's more of a teacher's role to kind of have these things come into the classroom rather than us advocating for such conversations?
I personally think that it's our responsibility to set an example. to our students to show that it is possible for an individual to take action. And much of my art deals with some aspects of climate change, and I feel like we need to let our students know that we're concerned as well.
I think I can add to that. In occupational therapy, it was a little bit of both student and faculty collaboration around adding a goal on care of the environment. The students were very, very concerned about care of the environment. So were faculty. So we added to our listening partnerships that piece through a collaborative discussion with faculty and students.
Hey, Jillian, I can chime in too. I think there's a heavy responsibility on the student as well, obviously, as the instructor. But if the instructor is not including these topics without student feedback, there would be no way of knowing whether or not they're doing something inappropriate. And if you're in a field that doesn't really cover climate justice or climate change on a regular basis, it may be very difficult to know that your students want to talk about these things if they do. So if you're a student, teachers, we listen. Like, our ears are tuned directly to our students, you know? So if students say something, we typically listen and react. You know, I've never met a teacher that said, I don't listen to my students at all. Their feedback means nothing. You know, we don't think like that. Your feedback is so incredibly important for scoping our pedagogy. And so without student feedback, some of these topics may go uncovered in classes if there is no feedback. So I think there's a heavy responsibility on the student as well as the instructor, of course.
That's been great to hear. Obviously, it's a bit tough kind of going from a student role to come talk to a professor to talk about adding something or changing something in a classroom. As someone who is a student, it's a bit tough to talk to them one-on-one and get that change. But once that change does happen and we start having these conversations in the classroom, specifically directed at Professor Froelich and Professor Burt, who have had these conversations in the classroom before, how have you gotten students to kind of open up more and be more willing to talk about such tough topics with one another with such clarity and honesty?
I can share that I've had the privilege of teaching small group classes on communication, culture, and groups and therapeutic use of self, where I've had about 14 students in a group. So I think that's partly why it's been easy for students to open up. And it is in the classes, we're learning to communicate and to take risks and be assertive. So I think that's part of why students have been able to open up.
That's great to hear. So there were a few questions directed at Professor England's discussion on the renewable energy and the difference between China and the US. So if you could talk, possibly, do you know a bit more about some upcoming new technologies in that area and whether they're gonna
Yeah, I
be
certainly
good?
could say something. I'll try to make it short. For lack of time, I did not get into all the technologies that are in development. I was just talking about some of the ones that are already available and are developed. So there's a lot of really smart people working on this problem. And for example, lithium is a very scarce resource, and you know, some of the minerals they make these batteries out of are very cause environmental degradation when they mine them, right? So one of the technologies being explored is sodium batteries. That sodium chloride, salt, is very abundant, obviously, in seawater, for example. So we're never going to run out of that. And there's many other examples, you know, around, if people are interested. That would be a whole other talk, you know. But the other question was the difference between China and the US. And I think one of my slides had this, the cumulative production of CO2 by China and the US. And while China's catching up, they're about half what they produced about half what we produced over time. So, you know, that's still a big difference. And And it's not to say that, the US is to blame for all of this. Some of this happened before people even knew there was climate change. That's not the point. The point is that we have a lot of work to do here. And if we start doing that work, we'll be in a much better position to talk to other countries about it. Make sense?
Makes total sense. Thank you for answering those questions. So some people in the chat have asked kind of what they can do in their own personal fields of study to combat this discussion and combat the waste happening in the world. So one thing would be how future teachers could start having this conversation, and how do you implement such things into a classroom? And how have you guys done it in the past, or how do you see people in the future implementing it?
Well, I think it's more of a call than ever. I talked about like 10 years ago, we added the care of the environment goal into the student goals they were working on in the class. And I just think it's so much more of a pressing issue now that I just think we need to have more and more of these open discussions with faculty and students about moving forward collaboratively. And as others have mentioned, sometimes it can just be 5 minutes of a class. It doesn't have to be the whole class.
And for future teachers out there, if anyone's coming to become a teacher, you're going to have to write a teaching philosophy at some point. And you're going to have to give that to your supervisor. And so in your teaching philosophy, if you include climate change, climate justice, then your supervisor is well aware that that's part of your teaching philosophy, and therefore it will be in your classroom. And that's how a lot of, professors will go about expressing their philosophy around these issues, is through their teaching philosophy. And your teaching philosophy comes out in your classroom in various ways. So as you, a new teacher, start to think about your teaching philosophy and what you want your pedagogy to be, then you just have to make a concerted effort to include climate change and climate justice. And it will come out then, if it's in your philosophy, it will naturally come out in your teaching.
Great idea.
We discussed specifically at the beginning, Professor Labont discussed kind of the 5 minutes, all it needs. And that's kind of one of the ways that we could fit it into a jam-packed curriculum. Do you also feel that there should be more than just one conversation fit in at the end of a conversation, at the end of like a lesson or something, or if it's like a continuous conversation, or if that's all time you have is just trying to get that one little bit in? How do you like fit it in after that first conversation?
I'll just say quick, I was able to integrate it throughout the class, maybe 5 minutes in several classes, because students were checking in on how they were doing on all their goals related to effective communication, personal health and wellness, group leadership, and care of the environment. So we were able to come back to it in that class, have check-ins, brief within class about how it was going around goals related to care of the environment.
Jillian, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
How many classes do you think, are you done? Did you graduate? Is that what you said? Is that correct?
I have not graduated yet, but
how many classes have you taken at UNE?
As many as 120 credits are.
So what is that? Like, 30, I don't know, 30 classes, maybe 40 classes. So if each one of those just did a 1 5-minute talk, right? Just one. Then that means that you would have had 30 to 40 different instances where you had to contemplate, think, and really digest climate change and climate justice. That's a lot over a 3-year period. So I think even if you can only do it once, it's not about, making your individual class so special on this topic, but it's about the student. Everything is about the student. So if each class just did this once, right? That means that students would have 50 different instances where they are discussing this topic. And that is a lot. That's way more than the average person who's not, on a college campus, right? And so I think that, yeah, it's great if, like Jan, if you can get these multiple conversations in a row, obviously that's ideal. But if you can only spend 5 minutes, but every class or the majority of classes can do this, then boy, it becomes really powerful. So it's sort of it's great if there's a group mentality around it. And on UNE, I know that there exists quite a group mentality. A lot of people care about the environment here, and a lot of people are willing to do this, but they might not know how, and that's the biggest hurdle for us here right now, is that like the knowledge and tools to implement these things. So I think if you can do more, like Jan said, that's so awesome. That's the best, right? But if you can only do 5 minutes, well, that's a lot better than not doing anything at all.
And Greg, don't underestimate like what kind of discussions spin off from that 5 minutes among students with their peers, family members, friends, because more and more people, I think, understand we got to talk about climate, right? Catherine K. Hayhoe, the climate scientist, we've got to talk about it. It's one of the most important ways to address this problem is talking. So I think those 5 minutes in class probably generate more discussion than we're aware of.
Awesome.
Yeah, so in an ideal world, would you guys think that UNE should kind of have a policy to talk about these things, or do you feel, or what ideal world, in an ideal world, what do you see UNE's future policy around climate change and climate action being? And if you would like to all share that with us.
I'd love to have a student council gather and think about it, what they would like to see, how much they would like it to be infused, put their minds together and really say what should be done. Because I think there's just a way to have some creative, flexible thinking about this that some of us older folks may not have. So I'd love to hear a lot more from students about how it should be infused within the curriculum.
I also think it's just an existential emergency. So if we're not doing something, it's on us. What's our duty to our students? We are in an emergency situation. And the vast majority of scientific evidence points to that. We need to take action. That's all there is to it. So.
By the way, I totally agree with that. And I don't want to give the impression in my presentation that I didn't think there was a serious emergency to deal with. Just that I think that sometimes we teeter over the edge from that to despair and thinking there's nothing we can do, and we can do something. So.
And I'll just say, oh yeah, go ahead, Jan.
Oh, I'll just say, and every 10th of a degree matters. We may not be able to stay below 1.5, but every 10th of a degree saves thousands and thousands of lives. So everything we do matters. Greg.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I definitely do not think that it should be mandatory in the UNE policy. Forcing teachers to do something never ends well, like ever, regardless of what the topic is. It's always very, very touchy. But as Stephen said, we are in this crisis. So us as instructors, we should feel empowered or compelled to do so. And I think on UNE, I do feel most of my colleagues, although I'm in biology, most of my colleagues are very gung-ho at let's put this stuff in our curriculum. And even, my colleagues down the door here are in the English department, and they are all about getting climate change, climate justice into their curriculum. So I do feel that if it comes from within, it's much more powerful than being told you have to do this. So I don't think UNE should put a policy for inside the classroom, but I do think that there should be sort of this understanding for new hires who UNE brings onto campus that, hey, this is important to us. We really care about climate change. It doesn't matter if you teach calculus, chemistry, biology, English, this is important to us. And we want you to do this of your own volition, but we want you to do this.
Greg, I agree with you that faculty don't like to be told what to. I've been here 33 plus years, by the way. But I think if there was a groundswell from students, if there was more insistence from students, I think even the more reluctant faculty would consider it, because I've had conversations. Some faculty really think the situation is hopeless, but I think if they heard from students that we want to go for, we want this to be addressed. And I just want to come back to that point. Like, I think a lot of us realize 1.5, we're going to go over 1.5 degrees centigrade, but every 10th of a degree matters. So maybe we're not going to, keep it at 1.5. But I think we need to bring the people with despair along. Because some of the faculty, I think, just feel more despair and hopelessness than others. Right.
Yeah.
And I'll just reiterate, I think a groundswell from students, because faculty are very receptive to students, very receptive to the input, very interested in student input. And I think that could have a big impact.
Jan, I could not agree more. I really could not.
That's obviously great to hear. A lot of people were talking about how much they loved the integration of talking about these issues in the art class and kind of other disciplines, and they were kind of wondering how in the medical community it affects the interaction between provider and patient, knowing about these things and having discussions prior. So if Professor Froelich, you have any insight on that and what the knowledge has done to change the interaction between provider and patient.
Oh, that's a whole other thing, isn't it? One thing I think a lot about is, climate grief and climate anxiety. And we've had last year when we had the Solve Climate, we had some psychologists talk a lot about that, which was quite wonderful. I know that, my students, occupational therapists, work with all kinds of people. I've specialized mostly in the mental health field. And I know climate grief and climate anxiety is it's just a huge issue. Right. And it's just so important as practitioners that we be smart about it, understand it, and be able to, it's essential to our practice that we have a grasp of this so that we can give our clients a hand with climate grief and climate anxiety. And we need to give each other, we feel it too. So I think it's not hard to make these direct connections, between climate change and helping our students be the best practitioners possible by getting a grasp on how to handle. So that's my take on it as a healthcare practitioner. This is really essential to understand how to work with as a budding health professional.
So thank you so much to all our panelists and to our wonderful audience members and to our discussion moderator, Jillian, for all the insightful questions and comments, this thoughtful, engaging discussion. For the sake of time, I do have to transition us to wrap up our presentation with some final notes. So please stick around as I do a few thanks and final reminders. So I definitely want to thank our 4 amazing panelists for sharing your inspiration, for sharing your expertise. We're really grateful you took the time to be with us here today. Thank you to our audience members. And if you have any more questions or thoughts that you want to share with our panelists, please check out the contact information on the screen. They would love to hear from you. Also, audience members, please fill out this really brief attendance survey before you leave today. We would really appreciate it. We deeply value your feedback, and your feedback is used to inform our future events. So please do fill out this attendance survey. I think a link is also being dropped to this survey in the chat that you can complete as well. As a reminder to all students, this event addressed the interprofessional competencies of communication and roles and responsibilities, and it can be applied to your interprofessional honors distinction. I also want to thank our amazing partners, the UNE Planetary Health Council, the Center for Excellence in Collaborative Education, the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and of course, UNE Communications. Without all of you, these events would not be possible. And a huge thanks to our audience for joining us here today. Climate change and climate justice are truly transdisciplinary. And it's only when we unite across disciplines to discuss and grapple with these issues together that we have the greatest potential for solving them. Thank you.